The mountain wind moved like a slow exhale from something ancient and half asleep, brushing through the high pines that clung to the ridges above the crumbling Italian front, as if they too were trying to flee the approach of winter and the collapse of an empire. In the final months of 1943, when the Axis retreat had begun to unravel into scattered pockets of desperation, a captain named Vittorio Albiani rode at the head of a dwindling column of soldiers who no longer believed in orders, victory, or even survival. They marched through the Apennine passes with the hollow steps of men who were carrying more ghosts than equipment, leaving behind burning villages, abandoned fortifications, and the strange metallic silence that follows bombardments. It was in that bleak world of fractured loyalties and collapsing terrain that the story of the vanished captain first took shape, though no one would understand its true dimensions until a relic resurfaced decades later, pulling threads of history into the present, like a hand reaching out of a forgotten grave. Vittorio had been born in a fishing town on the Ligurian coast, a thin settlement of stone alleys and salt-stained nets, where the horizon seemed to trap both promise and sorrow. Those who remembered him as a boy said he had a peculiar way of staring at maps long before he understood the cities and borders they represented, tracing invisible routes across the paper as though he were trying to escape something no one else could see. When the war began, he enlisted not out of devotion to the rising tide of politics, but out of a yearning to understand the world that had always pressed against the edges of his imagination. Yet the truth of the conflict, the suffering it demanded, and the moral fractures it carved into the hearts of those who survived its storms, changed him more profoundly than any landscape he encountered. By 1943, he was a man marked by too many choices and too many losses, walking the fog-drenched mountains with a map case always pressed against his chest, as if guarding something more fragile than ink and paper. Rumors about that map had begun long before his disappearance, whispered by the soldiers who marched under him through the broken valleys, where partisan gunfire echoed between the trees like distant thunder. Some said the map contained details of abandoned Axis positions, hidden supply caches, and secret escape routes that could have altered the final stages of the retreat. Others insisted it held markings unrelated to military strategy, strange symbols Vittorio had added by hand during lonely nights when he thought no one was watching. These men claimed they had seen him kneeling over the parchment by the light of a dying fire, sketching figures that were not roads or rivers, as if he were documenting something that moved just beyond the reach of reason or survival. They watched him work in silence, uneasy, until the last spark inside the firewood faded, and the cold returned to reclaim the camp. The column's retreat through the mountains was shaped by a constant sense of being hunted, not only by Allied aircraft slicing the sky in search of targets, but also by the shadows hiding within the dense forests. Bandits, deserters, and partisan fighters all moved through the terrain like ghosts, striking at isolated units and vanishing again before anyone could respond. Vittorio seemed to navigate this world with an instinct that unnerved even his closest men, avoiding certain valleys without explanation and altering their direction at the slightest shift in the wind. When pressed, he said he relied not on orders but on reading the land, a phrase that only deepened the unease within the column. It was during one of these unexplained detours that the soldiers first realized Vittorio was no longer following the official maps issued by the command. Instead, he was consulting the mysterious chart he always kept hidden beneath his coat, glancing at it with the intensity of someone listening to a voice that only he could hear. The tension reached its peak on a night thick with fog, when the column took shelter in the ruins of an old monastery perched along a cliff overlooking a ravine. The monastery had once housed monks who prayed for the souls of travelers lost in the mountains, but during the war it had become a place of broken windows, burned books, and echoes of unseen steps moving through dust. It was in that crumbling sanctuary that one of Vittorio's lieutenants approached him, demanding an explanation for the erratic route that had left them exhausted, hungry, and dangerously exposed. Vittorio offered no comforting answers. Instead, he whispered that there were places the retreat must avoid, traces of older paths he had discovered on his map, paths that led to safety or doom depending on how they were read. His lieutenant reported later that the captain's eyes held a brightness that seemed fevered, as though the weight of his knowledge had begun to distort the reality around him. It was somewhere between the ruins of that monastery and the next mountain pass that Vittorio vanished. The men awoke one morning to find his bedroll undisturbed, his rifle abandoned, and his footsteps leading only a few meters into the forest before disappearing entirely, swallowed by the scattered leaves and the silence of the pines. The map case, however, was gone. At first the unit searched frantically, calling for their captain as if sound alone could pull him from the shadows. But the forest gave no answers. Some claimed to hear a faint echo, the rustle of branches or a distant whistle carried by the wind. But it might have been nothing more than the trembling of their own nerves. The retreat continued without him, hollow and directionless, haunted by a sense that something had shifted in the fabric of the mountains. Stories spread quickly among both Axis and partisan groups about a captain who had walked into the wilderness and vanished without a trace, carrying with him a map that many believed held far more than military secrets. And now, before we move deeper into this darkness, a question rises like a quiet whisper from the shadows themselves. From where are you watching this story unfold? Share it in the comments, not as a break in the tension, but as another voice added to the echoing corridor of those who walk with us through this forgotten moment in history. Decades passed after the war, reshaping borders and memories, burying the horrors of battle beneath monuments and silence. Families mourned, nations rebuilt, and the vanished captain remained nothing more than a strange footnote in military archives. Archivists and historians occasionally stumbled upon references to him, always brief and incomplete, as if someone had systematically stripped the details from the official records. Even veterans who survived the retreat offered only fragmented testimonies, their recollections clouded by trauma and time. Yet the whisper of his name endured in small towns along the mountains, spoken by those whose grandparents once saw him pass through in the fog of those desperate days. They remembered a man who carried himself with a mix of determination and sorrow, who always seemed to be listening for something no one else could hear. The mystery might have faded entirely into the realm of myth, if not for an unexpected discovery in 2023, when a private collector from Rimini contacted a historian who specialized in lost military documents. The collector claimed he had purchased an old wooden chest from an estate sale, the property of a reclusive mountaineer who had lived for decades in near isolation. Inside the chest, hidden beneath geological surveys and personal journals, was a map case made of cracked leather and sealed with a tarnished clasp. When the historian opened it, unfolding the fragile parchment with gloved hands, he realized he was staring at something extraordinary. The map showed the familiar geography of the northern Apennines, but marked upon it were strange symbols, circles, and faint hand-drawn routes that diverged sharply from official wartime charts. Some markings matched descriptions from the testimonies of the soldiers who had followed Vittorio. Others had no apparent meaning at all, resembling constellations mapped onto the land or ancient pathways long forgotten. News of the resurfaced map spread quietly among researchers, ignored by mainstream media, but drawing intense attention from those who had spent years studying lost units and unexplained disappearances during the retreat. For them, the reappearance of the document was more than a historical curiosity. It was a doorway into a mystery that had resisted answers for 80 years. Some believed the symbols encoded clandestine operations conducted by splintered groups during the war. Others suspected the markings indicated old smuggling routes used during earlier centuries, rediscovered by the captain during his travels. A few more imaginative voices whispered that the markings suggested something older than the war itself, paths and warnings long erased from conventional maps, but preserved by someone who sensed their significance. Whatever the truth was, the resurfacing of the map reopened a wound in the history of the region. Families of soldiers who vanished during the retreat contacted researchers, hoping the document might reveal the fate of their relatives. Explorers began to hike through the mountain passes, following the strange hand-drawn paths in search of answers. But for our purposes, the map serves as the flickering lantern that illuminates the first steps into a deeper story, one that reaches across time with a grip both cold and relentless. Before we leave this first descent into the darkness surrounding Captain Vittorio and his enigmatic disappearance, let the shadows carry a quiet invitation. If this story has already pulled you into its depths, consider subscribing to the channel so that each chapter of this journey reaches you as soon as it emerges from the fog. There is still so much more to uncover, and the path ahead only grows darker. Under the dim glow of a desk lamp, the map lay open across a table in a quiet apartment in Bologna, its edges frayed like skin too long exposed to the sun. The ink faded, but still breathing secrets beneath the paper's surface. The historian who had received it, Lorenzo Ferretti, sat motionless for several minutes, the air around him heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, as if the map itself exhaled the residue of the war it had survived. He had examined hundreds of documents from the Second World War, but nothing about this one aligned with the logic of ordinary cartography. The symbols seemed to shift meaning under his gaze, some geometric and precise, others fluid, as though drawn by a trembling hand. Certain areas of the parchment were darker, as if they had been exposed to fire or moisture, yet the markings in those places remained disturbingly intact. Lorenzo's pulse quickened, not because he believed in curses or superstitions, but because something in that map felt deliberate, as if it had been waiting to be found. Outside his window, the city was soaked in autumn rain, each drop on the glass a quiet metronome counting down to an inevitable revelation. He traced one of the hand-drawn routes with his finger, following a curved line that wound between two valleys near the region of Garfagnana, an area known for its labyrinthine passes and countless wartime graves. The route ended abruptly near an unmarked peak, where a small circle had been drawn in faded crimson ink. Beside it, a few illegible words in Italian, written in a hand so deteriorated it was almost impossible to distinguish letters from scratches. Yet the color of the ink, its hue deeper and more organic than ordinary pigment, stirred something uneasy in Lorenzo's thoughts. The collector who had sold him the chest had mentioned that the mountaineer who owned it before had disappeared during a winter expedition in 1979, never recovered despite extensive searches. That coincidence now pressed against the edges of his mind like an unwelcome whisper. He decided to digitize the map that same night, scanning each section meticulously, enlarging it to reveal patterns invisible to the naked eye. When viewed under infrared light, several faint inscriptions emerged along the margins, Coordinates, numbers, and short fragments of text written in a language that blended Italian with an older, almost liturgical structure. The most prominent of these fragments repeated a single phrase, "Dove l'eco non ritorna," where the echo does not return. The meaning felt both poetic and dreadful, suggesting a place so deep or desolate that even sound refused to come back. It was a phrase that would later appear in scattered wartime diaries from soldiers stationed in the northern Apennines, though historians had always dismissed it as a metaphor for isolation or despair. Now confronted with its appearance on the map itself, Lorenzo began to suspect it had once referred to a real location, one deliberately erased from military documentation. In the days that followed, his apartment transformed into a command center of obsession. Old books, scanned archives, and half-translated documents cluttered the floor. He barely slept, moving between screens and papers with the vacant focus of someone chasing a ghost. Through university contacts, he gained access to declassified Axis communications and partisan reports from 1943 to 1945, searching for any mention of Captain Vittorio Albiani. There were few. A transport manifest listed him as commanding an engineering unit assigned to maintain supply lines between Modena and La Spezia, a task that would have given him intimate knowledge of mountain routes. Another file referenced an investigation into irregular conduct during the retreat, though the details had been redacted long ago. In the margins of one document, a faded note, written in pencil, seemed to refer to him simply as l'uomo con la mappa, the man with the map. It was the only surviving acknowledgement that his possession of such a document had been known to others. The deeper Lorenzo delved, the more the past began to blur with the present. Late at night, as he compared the strange symbols to old regional folklore, he began noticing that many of the markings corresponded to sites associated with disappearances long before the war, places where shepherds, pilgrims, or smugglers had vanished over the centuries. One of the symbols, a circle intersected by 3 lines, appeared in medieval manuscripts describing the Sentieri del Silenzio, the paths of silence, believed to be cursed routes used by fugitives and heretics to escape inquisitorial patrols. These routes were said to cross areas where compasses failed and sound died, where even the wind moved differently. At first, Lorenzo dismissed the connection as coincidence, but then he found a 1912 surveyor's map from the same region that included several of these ancient paths, all marked with a faint warning, Zona di Resonanza Perduta, Lost Resonance Zone. The term sent a chill through him, not for its supernatural tone, but for its precision. It was as if each generation had inherited fragments of a secret geography too dangerous to name outright. By the 3rd week of research, Lorenzo's correspondence with other historians had grown cryptic. He wrote not about war or strategy, but about echoes and alignment, about a pattern in the terrain that does not belong to the terrain. His closest friend, an archaeologist named Giulia Conti, tried to intervene, suggesting that he rest, that he was projecting meaning onto random anomalies. Yet curiosity eventually pulled her into his orbit. When she visited his apartment one evening, she found the map spread across the floor, weighted down by glass jars and books. The lights were dimmed except for a single lamp, and in its glow the inked lines seemed to shimmer faintly, as if responding to their presence. Lorenzo pointed toward the crimson circle near the unmarked peak and told her he believed it was a meeting point, not of soldiers, but of something older, a convergence between paths that no longer existed on modern maps. Giulia, skeptical but intrigued, agreed to join him in retracing one of the marked routes the following week. What began as academic curiosity would soon turn into a descent neither of them could reverse. The journey began under a low sky in late November. The mountains were veiled in mist, their silhouettes dissolving into each other like layers of forgotten memory. Lorenzo carried a printed reproduction of the map sealed in plastic, checking it against his GPS and modern topographic charts. The discrepancies were immediate. The old paths no longer aligned with any known trails, yet the terrain itself seemed to guide them unconsciously toward the directions marked on the map. As they climbed higher, cell reception faded, and the forest began to thicken with gnarled trees whose roots broke through the soil like veins. The silence there was unlike any ordinary stillness, not peaceful but expectant, as if the entire landscape were listening. When they spoke, their voices seemed to die a short distance away, swallowed by the air itself. They reached the approximate coordinates of the Crimson Circle just before dusk. The light had turned copper, filtered through the mist, and the cold was biting. What they found was not a summit, but a depression in the terrain, a narrow basin surrounded by limestone cliffs, where the ground was scattered with fragments of brick and rusted metal. It looked as though a structure had once stood there, long destroyed and reclaimed by the forest. In the center of the basin, half buried under moss and soil, was a stone marker inscribed with characters eroded beyond recognition. But when Julia brushed the dirt away, the faint trace of a symbol became visible. The same circle intersected by 3 lines that appeared on the map. The sight of it made them both freeze. Lorenzo knelt beside it, his gloved hand trembling as he touched the carving. For a moment he thought he heard a low vibration rising from the ground, almost like the resonance of a distant engine or a subterranean hum, though Julia insisted she heard nothing. They decided to set up camp nearby, hoping to examine the site more thoroughly at dawn. But that night, as the wind moved through the valley, Lorenzo awoke to the sensation of pressure in his ears, as though the air itself were thickening. The campfire's glow trembled with unnatural rhythm, dimming and flaring as if responding to something unseen. He rose, disoriented, and walked a few meters toward the center of the basin. There, at the edge of the stone marker, he saw the soil shifting, not dramatically, but with subtle motion, as though something beneath were stirring. Julia called his name from the tent, her voice strained, but by the time he turned to answer, the sound of her voice seemed distant, distorted, as if filtered through water. Then came the silence, a complete, suffocating absence of sound, where even his heartbeat seemed to vanish. He stumbled backward, terrified, and the moment he crossed a certain invisible line, the noise of the world returned. The crackling fire, Julia's panicked breathing, the rustle of branches. It was as if he had stepped out of one reality and into another before being thrown back. The following morning, neither could explain what had happened. The instruments they carried, compasses, recorders, even a small drone, had all malfunctioned at the same moment during the night. The footage captured before the failure showed brief flickers of movement in the dark, figures barely perceptible between the trees, though analysis would later reveal them as visual artifacts caused by condensation on the lens. Still, something about the experience left them shaken. Julia wanted to leave immediately, but Lorenzo insisted on staying until he could document the site properly. His reasoning was simple. If Captain Vittorio had indeed vanished near this place, the answers might lie buried somewhere beneath their feet. By late afternoon, as the mist thickened once again, Julia noticed something glinting between two stones near the base of the marker. It was a fragment of metal, small and oddly shaped, tarnished but intact. When she handed it to Lorenzo, he recognized the remnants of an insignia, an officer's pin, the design partially eroded, but still bearing the faint outline of the Italian crown used by the Royal Army before the Republic. It was impossible to say whose it had been, yet the coincidence was undeniable. The last known position of Captain Vittorio's unit had been less than 5 kilometers from this location. The air around them grew colder as the realization sank in. After 8 decades, they might be standing on the very ground where the captain had disappeared. And as the last traces of daylight dissolved behind the peaks, Lorenzo felt a certainty he couldn't explain, that whatever had claimed the captain had not entirely left. The silence returned, heavy and absolute, and somewhere deep in that wordless expanse, he thought he heard a whisper too faint to belong to any living voice. It was not an echo. It was a calling. If this dark journey through time still holds you in its grasp, let the shadows know. Subscribe, stay close, and do not look away, for the next descent will take us further beneath the surface, where the map begins to speak in ways no one can fully comprehend. The descent into what lay beneath the surface began not with courage, but with necessity. After returning from the mountains, Lorenzo and Julia carried something intangible back with them, a silence that clung to their skin, a tension that refused to dissolve. The world outside had resumed its ordinary rhythm, traffic murmuring through Bologna, the air heavy with espresso and damp concrete, yet both of them moved through it as if submerged, half present, half elsewhere. The fragment of metal they recovered sat on Lorenzo's desk like an accusation, its dull gleam reflecting the cold glow of his computer screens. Analysis confirmed what they feared. The insignia dated precisely to 1943, issued exclusively to officers of the 72nd Engineering Regiment, the same division commanded by Captain Vittorio Albiani during the final retreat through the Apennines. It was not proof of his death, but it was enough to suggest that he had indeed reached that valley, perhaps even left something behind there before he vanished. Julia, once skeptical, began to share Lorenzo's unease. She spent her evenings studying geological surveys of the area, searching for anomalies that might explain the sound distortion they had experienced. What she found was troubling. Beneath the coordinates of the basin, seismic maps revealed a network of limestone caverns extending for several kilometers, many of them undocumented and unstable. Yet even the few existing records described strange acoustic phenomena within, echoes that folded in on themselves, delayed or reversed, and vibrations that caused instruments to fail. Locals avoided the area, referring to it in old dialect as La gola che non risponde, the gorge that does not answer. The coincidence with the map's phrase, dove l'eco non ritorna, was impossible to ignore. Julia proposed that the captain may have discovered these caverns during the retreat and recorded their locations on his map, for reasons lost to time. But Lorenzo sensed there was more. Something beyond geology, something that had pulled both men toward the same silence, separated by 80 years. The first real sign that they were being drawn into something far older came in the form of a letter. It arrived one morning without a return address, postmarked from a small town near Lucca. Inside, written on yellowed stationery, was a short message. He didn't disappear. He entered the passage. The map is not to guide the living. There was no signature, no explanation, only a faint scent of earth on the paper, as though it had been stored underground. Lorenzo's attempts to trace the sender led nowhere. The handwriting did not match any known records, and the post office confirmed that the envelope had been dropped anonymously in their outdoor box at night. Julia urged him to disregard it, dismissing it as a hoax. But deep down she could see in his eyes that the letter had confirmed his worst suspicion. Whatever they had uncovered was not forgotten. Someone, or something, had been keeping the secret alive. Over the following weeks, Lorenzo began receiving other fragments, photocopies of old field reports, anonymous notes, and even a blurred photograph showing what appeared to be the same stone marker partially unearthed decades earlier. The reports referenced unexplained subsidence near a defunct military supply route in 1943, and a small detachment of soldiers dispatched to investigate before losing contact entirely. Officially, the incident was listed as an avalanche. Unofficially, there were testimonies from villagers who claimed to have heard mechanical noises beneath the ground at night, followed by a sound like deep breathing that continued for days before abruptly stopping. The language of these documents oscillated between military pragmatism and superstition, as though those who wrote them had no vocabulary adequate to describe what they had encountered. Driven by obsession, Lorenzo and Julia returned to the site in early spring, bringing better equipment, ground-penetrating radar, audio sensors, and a drone fitted with infrared. The forest had changed. The winter frost had stripped it bare, exposing the skeleton of the terrain. The basin looked smaller than before, as if the earth itself had shifted inward. Beneath the damp soil where they had found the insignia, the radar detected a hollow chamber several meters below. It was irregular in shape, descending deeper than their instruments could measure. When Lorenzo adjusted the frequency, the signal began to echo faintly, a rhythmic pulse, mechanical yet organic, repeating every 12 seconds. Julia stared at the screen, her voice trembling as she whispered that it almost resembled a heartbeat. That night the air grew heavy again. The same vibration returned, subtle but unmistakable, running through the ground and up their spines. They recorded the sound on multiple devices, but upon playback it was always missing, replaced by a faint hiss of static, or in one case a low voice whispering in Italian, "Torna dove il suono muore." Go back where the sound dies. It was enough to break Julia's resolve. She left the site the next morning, promising to return only when Lorenzo had regained perspective. But Lorenzo did not stop. Alone in the forest, he began digging at the base of the stone marker, convinced that the chamber below held whatever truth the captain had discovered. His notes from those days, later found scattered in his apartment, became increasingly erratic. He wrote of geometry that breathes and paths that fold back on themselves. One page contained a single sentence repeated dozens of times. He never left the map. When Julia returned days later with a small rescue team, Lorenzo was gone. His tent had collapsed inward, his belongings left untouched. The ground near the stone marker showed signs of disturbance. A shallow pit half filled with water and mud. The soil at its edges appeared burned, though no fire had been lit. The only trace of him was a torn section of the map, caught against a root, its ink smeared but still visible. On it, someone had drawn a new line leading downward, not across the terrain, but vertically, as if marking a descent into the earth itself. It ended with the same crimson circle that had haunted their research from the beginning. The team searched for days, calling his name through the forest, but the only response was the echo of their own voices, distorted and faint. And then, as before, came the moment when the echoes stopped returning altogether. Julia's testimony to the authorities was measured, rational, stripped of anything that might sound like madness. She spoke of erosion, of unstable ground, of a possible cave-in, but privately, she told friends that she could still feel the vibration beneath her feet whenever she closed her eyes. Weeks later, a hiker reported seeing a light flickering near the basin at night. A pale, unsteady glow that moved as if carried by an unseen hand. By the time anyone arrived, it was gone, leaving behind only the imprint of footprints that began in the mud and ended abruptly at the pit's edge. The rescue teams expanded their search radius, but the terrain yielded nothing more. Officially, Lorenzo Ferretti joined the long list of disappearances tied to the mountains, another name lost to the silence. Unofficially, whispers began to circulate again among locals, blending his story with that of the vanished captain. They said the map had chosen him, that it never truly belonged to any one man, that it was less a guide than an invitation. Back in Bologna, Julia sealed what remained of the documents, the photographs, and the torn piece of the map into a metal box, and delivered it to a regional archive under her own name. But at night she kept dreaming of the valley, the pulse beneath the ground, and the faint whisper that had seemed to echo from the pit before the silence consumed it. She had heard it only once, but the memory lingered. A voice, low and distant, repeating the same phrase in Italian. Non è finita. It is not over. If you have followed this story so far, if you feel the pull of what still lies hidden beneath these mountains, then stay close to this channel. The shadows are only beginning to move, and the map has not yet revealed its final direction. The metal box that Julia delivered to the regional archive sat undisturbed for almost a year, sealed and catalogued under a reference code few would ever notice. Bureaucracy has a way of hiding the extraordinary within the mundane, and in those quiet corridors lined with paper and silence, the remnants of the map slept again. It might have remained there indefinitely, if not for a graduate researcher named Matteo Rinaldi, a quiet, precise man whose fascination with unclassified wartime correspondence bordered on obsession. In the spring of 2024, while cataloging misfiled documents, he discovered Julia's box buried within a stack of unrelated records. The label read only, "Recovered Field Material, Apennine Sector." Inside, he found the photographs, the letter, and the fragment of parchment with its smeared crimson mark. He didn't know then that what he was holding had already claimed 2 lives, and would soon begin reaching for his own. Matteo was not a man easily swayed by superstition. His work dealt in facts, the verifiable data, and the cold precision of cross-referenced archives, yet something in the rough texture of the parchment unsettled him. The way the faded lines seemed almost to shift under light, the way the stains had depth, as if they had soaked into layers invisible to the human eye. He enlarged one of the photographs Julia had taken of the basin, enhancing it through digital filters, and discovered faint shapes among the shadows, a suggestion of symmetrical patterns carved into the rocks surrounding the pit. Whether they were natural or deliberate, he couldn't say, but they appeared too orderly to be random. He began to reconstruct the entire map digitally, layering the coordinates, the handwritten notes, and the symbols into a composite model. When he aligned them using modern satellite imagery, the result defied logic. The roots formed a spiral, Each path, each curve, converged toward the same point in the mountains, the basin where both the captain and the historian had disappeared. The pattern pulsed faintly on his screen, and Matteo, curious, marked its geometric center. The coordinates corresponded to an area without any recorded name, a blank zone between two ridges, unregistered in municipal maps. The spiral itself seemed almost alive, as if designed to draw attention inward, to fold space around its own center. He remembered the phrase scrawled along the map's edge, "Dove l'eco non ritorna," and for the first time he wondered if the words were not a warning, but an instruction. Over the following weeks, Matteo's research took on a feverish intensity. He requested access to the original map for preservation scanning, convincing the archivists that he was studying pigment decay. Under multispectral analysis, more details surfaced. Beneath the visible ink were older markings, layers of drawings erased and overwritten, each iteration refining the same spiral pattern. Whoever had created the map had redrawn it multiple times, as though trying to capture something glimpsed only in fragments. The oldest layer, however, was not written in Italian. Its characters were archaic, almost runic, belonging to no known alphabet. Matteo sent the images to a linguistics colleague in Florence, who replied days later with a single, unsettling note. These symbols are not linguistic. They are positional, coordinates or ritual geometry. That phrase, ritual geometry, began to haunt him. He found himself awake at 3 a.m, staring at the glowing lines on his monitor, tracing them again and again. The spiral, when rotated and superimposed upon itself, revealed another shape within. A triangle intersected by 3 lines, identical to the symbol carved into the stone marker. The realization sent a chill through him. It meant the map was not merely geographic. It was constructed around a repeated mathematical design. He began to suspect that Vittorio Albiani had discovered something in those mountains that went beyond military value, something that had consumed him entirely. Matteo's notes from that period reveal a mind oscillating between discovery and delusion. He wrote that the spiral represented a harmonic of absence, that the map functioned not as a tool for travel, but as an instrument for resonance. In one entry, he claimed that sound itself behaved differently within the coordinates marked by the spiral, as though space were bending to accommodate a silence that did not belong to this world. He cross-referenced seismic records from the region, and indeed, he found anomalies. Periodic vibrations that occurred with irregular intervals, always near the basin, always faint but consistent, as if something deep underground was still moving, breathing, or remembering. His obsession did not go unnoticed. The archive supervisor, a woman named Claudia Ray, grew concerned after finding him asleep at his desk, surrounded by dozens of open files and the faint smell of burnt electronics. When she confronted him, he tried to explain the pattern, showing her the overlapping images, the impossible alignment of symbols. She dismissed it as pareidolia, the mind's tendency to impose meaning on randomness. But he insisted there was intent behind it, something deliberate embedded in the terrain itself. He spoke of the map as though it were alive, whispering through the ink. The argument ended abruptly when one of the scanners overloaded, emitting a high-pitched tone that sent both of them recoiling. When the device finally shut down, Matteo stared at its dark screen, pale and trembling, muttering that for a few seconds, the frequency had matched the one recorded by Lorenzo in the forest. A week later, Matteo vanished. Surveillance footage from the archive showed him leaving the building at 2:47 a.m., carrying a backpack and a rolled parchment tube. The security cameras at the city's train station recorded him purchasing a ticket to Lucca and then walking toward the mountain bus route that led into Garfagnana. No further trace of him was found. Authorities assumed suicide or deliberate disappearance, but the following month, hikers reported hearing voices at night near the same valley, overlapping whispers in Italian and another language they could not identify, echoing from beneath the ground, even when no one was speaking. The sound recorders brought to the area by investigators malfunctioned again, capturing only static interspersed with rhythmic pulses identical to those from Lorenzo's earlier tapes. It was Giulia who identified the voice. When she listened to the distorted recording released by local media, her eyes filled with terror. Beneath the interference, she heard her own name, repeated faintly in a tone she recognized. Matteo's voice, calling her from the depths. But in the last seconds of the tape, another voice emerged, deeper and older, speaking Italian with a dialect that had not existed for centuries. The translation was uncertain, but linguists agreed on one possible rendering. Another has entered. The path opens again. News outlets briefly reported the incident before dismissing it as a case of psychological contagion, hysteria, feeding on myth. Yet within the villages near the Apennines, the old stories resurfaced. Elders spoke of the Valle del Respiro, the Valley of Breath, where the earth sighs and swallows those who listen too closely. They claimed that during the war, German engineers had tried to drill into the mountain to install communication lines, only to abandon the effort after losing an entire team overnight. Locals said the sound of the drills had awakened something, an emptiness mistaken for space. That emptiness, they warned, had never closed again. Giulia, unable to remain silent, wrote a long letter to an investigative journalist detailing everything. The captain, the map, Lorenzo, and now Matteo. She ended it with a sentence that sounded more like confession than report. The map is not a record of where they went. It is what they became. The letter never reached its recipient. The envelope was later found in the lobby of her apartment building, unsealed, its pages removed. Only the final sentence remained, scrawled on the back of the envelope in her own handwriting, but with ink she swore she had never used. Dove l'eco non ritorna. The journalist assigned to the case refused to publish anything, citing pressure from the regional authorities, but he kept the letter in his private collection. Months later, he would tell a colleague that sometimes, when the night grew still and the apartment was quiet, he could hear faint tapping from within the drawer where the letter was stored, like someone tracing invisible roots beneath the paper. The captain had vanished 80 years earlier, yet his silence still echoed, reshaping those who came after him. The pattern was complete now, each generation drawn toward the same point in the map, like moths orbiting a light that burned from beneath the earth. And if the pattern held true, there would be another soon. The passage was opening again. If you have followed the whispers this far, keep the light low, stay with the story, and subscribe. The silence below is not finished, and what comes next may finally reveal what the captain saw when he stepped beyond the reach of sound. By the end of 2024, the story of the vanished map had spread quietly across Europe's darker corners of academia. Whispered about at conferences, exchanged in encrypted emails, discussed only after hours when the corridors of universities were empty. It was never an official topic of study, but an obsession that passed like a contagion between researchers, historians, and amateur cartographers who believed that every disappearance left behind an echo, and that those echoes, if assembled, could reveal a shape. They called it the geometry of absence, borrowing Matteo's final words from his recovered notes. What began as curiosity had become something close to a ritual of thought, an idea that demanded participation simply by being understood. In early 2025, a group of 5 researchers, 2 Italians, 1 French, 1 Polish, and 1 Canadian, formed an informal collective to re-examine the fragments of the Albiani map. They met online, trading scans and coordinates, convinced they could decipher its true purpose using modern analytical tools. Among them was Professor André Morel, an acoustic physicist from Lyon who specialized in spatial resonance and who had long been fascinated by reports of dead zones, places where sound collapsed or inverted. When he studied the available data from the Apennine region, he noticed something that none of the others had. The vibration frequencies recorded by Lorenzo and Matteo were not random. They followed a precise mathematical sequence, a progression that mirrored the spiral geometry embedded in the map. Morel proposed that the map was, in essence, a sonic blueprint, not a guide to geography, but a chart of frequencies, mapping how sound itself behaved across the terrain. The others dismissed the idea as poetic, but Morel persisted, claiming that if the pattern were replicated, it could reproduce the same phenomenon anywhere in the world. That was the beginning of the echo experiment. They set up the first test in a disused military bunker near Genoa, a relic from the war built deep into the limestone cliffs overlooking the sea. Using high-frequency sound generators and sensors, they replicated the vibration patterns taken from the recordings associated with the map. The equipment hummed faintly, the low tone pulsing through the walls in a rhythm almost imperceptible to human ears. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then, at precisely the 43rd minute, all the instruments flickered simultaneously. The sensors began to record a secondary resonance, one not generated by their equipment, an echo that returned not from the walls, but out from an undefined depth beneath them. The wave pattern was inverted, as though the sound had been absorbed and re-emitted by something vast and hollow below the bunker. The participants froze, watching as their readings spiraled into chaos. When the experiment finally stopped, silence pressed against them with a physical weight. The room felt smaller, denser. One of the researchers, a young woman named Eliza from Warsaw, reported a sensation of pressure in her chest, as if her lungs were being compressed from within. Morel ordered the generators shut down, but before they could disconnect the system, a thin crack appeared along one of the bunker's rear walls. From the fissure came a faint draft, cold and damp, carrying with it the scent of stone and iron, and beneath it, a sound so low it seemed less heard than felt. It was not mechanical. It was rhythmic, steady, almost organic. They sealed the room immediately, but none of them slept that night. In the morning, Eliza was gone. Her car remained in the parking lot, her phone still recording in her coat pocket. The last 30 seconds of the recording captured a single phrase whispered in French, though her voice trembled, "Il n'y a pas d'écho." There is no echo. The team disbanded within days. Morel returned to Lyon and refused to speak publicly about the experiment again. But colleagues noticed he had developed a strange habit, pausing mid-sentence, tilting his head as though listening for something no one else could hear. 6 months later, his body was found near the Rhone River, drowned, though no one could explain why his lungs contained not water, but air, so compressed it had ruptured the tissues, as if something had forced the breath out of him before he ever reached the surface. The event went unreported in the media. Only fragments of information leaked through underground academic channels, each more distorted than the last. Some said Morel had replicated the map's frequencies once more, alone, moments before his death. Others insisted he had discovered a way to visualize the spiral as a three-dimensional waveform, a pattern that, when rendered in sound, formed what he described in his final notes as a tunnel without depth. Whatever the truth, it was Julia who recognized the pattern of deaths and disappearances repeating once more, each echo overlapping the previous one. She began to record her thoughts in audio journals, her voice steady but tired, describing the chain of obsession that had begun with Vittorio Albiani and extended into her own life. "It doesn't end," she whispered in one of the final recordings. "It continues like a frequency that finds new receivers." One evening in February 2025, she drove alone into the mountains. A security camera captured her car passing through a small village, headlights cutting through the fog. Locals remembered seeing her stop at a gas station, where she asked for directions to a forest road that no longer appeared on maps. The clerk said she looked pale, distracted, her hands trembling as she handed him a folded photograph of the basin. It was the same image Lorenzo had taken years before. She asked if he recognized the place. He nodded slowly, saying his grandfather used to tell stories about it, that during the war soldiers camped there and heard the ground hum at night, like an engine idling beneath their feet. Julia smiled faintly, thanked him, and drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. A week later, her car was found abandoned near the edge of the same valley. The doors were locked, the keys still inside, the engine cold. Investigators found traces of soil on the tires, matching the composition of the basin floor, though the car was parked several kilometers away from it. The audio recorder she always carried was missing, but inside the glove compartment they found a torn page from her notebook. It contained a single line written in her own hand. "The silence is not empty. It's waiting." In the months that followed, a pattern of strange incidents spread quietly across the region. Hikers reported low-frequency vibrations beneath the ground. Animals were found dead without visible injury, their bodies positioned in unnatural symmetry. In nearby villages, church bells rang by themselves during nights of heavy mist, the sound echoing only once before dying abruptly. A shepherd claimed to have seen lights in the forest, moving slowly in a spiral. Each story was dismissed as local superstition, but collectively, they formed a mosaic of unease. It was as if the mountain itself had begun to awaken, remembering the steps of those who had vanished into its breathless heart. By late summer, a small team of journalists, led by the same man who had once received Julia's letter, decided to venture into the basin and document what remained. They carried high-end recording equipment and satellite communication devices, determined to disprove the myths once and for all. Their first dispatch described nothing unusual. A silent, desolate place, surrounded by trees and mist. On the second day, they reported equipment failures and interference. The last transmission arrived at dawn on the third day. The reporter's voice, thin and distant, came through the static. "We found it. There's a chamber below. The air is—" Then silence. The signal cut abruptly, and contact was never re-established. Weeks later, the footage recovered from their drone surfaced online. It showed the basin from above, fog swirling in slow motion. At first, nothing was visible. Then beneath the mist, the soil began to shift, spiraling inward, revealing the faint outline of a circular structure. Not natural, but built, ancient, and vast. For a moment, the drone's microphone captured a low, rhythmic pulse, and then the image fractured into black. The video spread briefly across obscure forums before vanishing entirely, taken down under unclear circumstances, but those who saw it described one final frame before the feed collapsed. A flash of red, the glimmer of a figure standing at the center of the spiral, looking upward, motionless. And so, the silence deepened once more. The captain's map had completed another cycle, claiming new witnesses, new echoes. What had begun in 1943 as a retreat through the dying empire of the Axis had become something else. A loop of disappearance and discovery feeding on its own history. The spiral did not end with time. It folded through it, waiting for the next to follow the path where the echo does not return. If the darkness of this story still holds you, let it breathe for a moment. And if you wish to follow it to its final descent, subscribe, stay near the silence, and prepare for the last truth that waits in the deep earth. The valley waited through winter, through thaw and storm, until the mountains softened again under fog and lichen. It was the kind of landscape that swallowed everything: footsteps, history, memory. In the spring of 2026, a rescue expedition from the Italian Alpine Corps returned to the coordinates that had consumed so many lives. They carried no cameras, no recorders, only standard-issue communication gear. Officially, they were searching for the missing journalists. Unofficially, the command report mentioned recurrent structural instability and unexplained acoustic anomalies. It was bureaucratic language for something no one dared to name. By the third day, 2 members of the team reported disorientation. The forest's geography did not remain constant. Paths twisted subtly, returning the men to places they had already crossed. Compasses spun. The ground itself seemed to hum. Sergeant Rossi, the leader, described a vibration that came through the soles of his boots and into his bones, a low rhythm that synced with his heartbeat until he could no longer tell which was which. At dusk, they reached the basin. The ground there was strangely warm, and the air shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. They set up camp at its edge, and in his log, Rossi wrote a single line before the entries ended. "It's like standing on a breath that has not yet been released." What happened that night is pieced together only from fragments. The team's radio operator transmitted a brief emergency message at 22:17, static, followed by a voice shouting, "The ground is opening." Then nothing, when a helicopter arrived 2 days later. The camp was gone. The tents were still standing, the supplies untouched, but no human trace remained. The soil bore marks of collapse, a shallow depression forming a perfect spiral, 8 meters wide, and in the center, embedded in the mud, the searchers found something that should not have survived the decades. A rusted officer's compass engraved with the initials VA. It was placed upright, its needle pointing straight down. That discovery broke through the silence that had guarded the story for generations. For the first time, national media picked it up, framing it as an unsolved wartime mystery. Television crews swarmed the nearby towns, interviewing old residents, scientists, priests. None of them could agree on what was happening. Some spoke of magnetic anomalies, others of old bunkers collapsing underground. But the older locals, those whose parents had seen soldiers vanish into the mist in 1943, warned the journalists to leave. "The valley breathes," they said. "Every few years it exhales, and those who hear it are taken." It sounded like folklore, until one of the reporters went missing after filming night footage at the basin's edge. His camera was later found lying in the moss. The last frame captured the landscape illuminated by his flashlight, and a single boot print in the mud, larger and deeper than his own, as if pressed by someone heavier, or by something rising from below. The footage reignited the legend of Captain Vittorio Albiani. Newspapers called him the ghost of the Apennines, inventing stories of hidden treasure, secret passages, Nazi relics. But beneath the noise, a few researchers saw the pattern repeating. Every attempt to reveal the truth, feeding the silence instead. The spiral was not a symbol. It was an appetite. In July, a small geological team funded by the university returned with drilling equipment to analyze the subsurface structure. Their sensors registered hollow space at 70 meters depth, a vast chamber, circular, with irregular metallic readings along its perimeter. When they began to drill, the bit stopped abruptly, striking something hard that rang with a metallic tone, unlike stone. The operator reversed the drill, and a black liquid seeped up through the borehole, thick and cold. It smelled not of oil or decay, but of ozone, as if the air itself had burned. Within minutes, the wind across the valley ceased. Birds fell silent, and then the equipment's vibration meters recorded a pulse. Steady, measured, identical in frequency to the recordings left by Lorenzo and Matteo years before. The drillers fled. That same night, tremors shook the nearby villages. Windows rattled, dogs howled, and refused to enter their kennels. Some locals claimed to hear voices under the ground, not screaming, not crying, but murmuring as if in conversation. Authorities dismissed the events as minor seismic activity, yet those who ventured near the basin afterward described the soil as breathing, rising, and falling imperceptibly underfoot. No vegetation grew there anymore. By autumn, the valley had become a restricted zone. Fences appeared. Warning signs in multiple languages were posted, citing geological hazard. But at night, lights could still be seen descending from helicopters, men in unmarked uniforms moving through the mist with heavy cases and sensors. Whatever they found was never made public. What leaked through anonymous sources spoke of tunnels opening beneath the valley, artificial structures, walls lined with symbols identical to those drawn on the Albiani map. Someone reported that the walls emitted faint sound, even when no device was active. A low tone that caused nausea and disorientation. The site was sealed entirely within weeks, and yet the silence spread. In October, several residents from nearby towns began reporting dreams. Identical in detail, they described standing inside a vast chamber, lit by a dull red glow, surrounded by figures motionless and featureless, like silhouettes carved from stone. In each dream, a voice spoke a single phrase in Italian. Il capitano aspetta. The captain waits. One woman awoke with dried soil under her fingernails. Another claimed she could still smell the scent of iron and damp paper. The dreams stopped only when the valley was closed to all civilians. But by then, rumors had escaped across the internet, blending fact and fiction until no one could separate them. The legend had finally become immortal, self-sustaining, feeding on its own retelling. Deep within the archives of Bologna, the metal box Giulia once sealed remained locked. A new curator, unaware of its history, decided to re-examine the contents. When he opened it, he found the original fragment of the map darker than before, its edges curling inward as if scorched. Across its surface, the crimson circle had deepened to near black. Under low light, faint new lines appeared, extensions of the spiral, stretching outward toward places unmarked before. He noted the anomaly in his report, but dismissed it as ink oxidation. That night, security footage recorded the faint echo of a low hum reverberating through the archive's corridors. None of the alarms triggered. Nothing moved, except a single page fluttering on the desk where the map lay open. Somewhere beyond the reach of microphones, beneath the limestone and roots, something had awakened fully. The passages Vittorio marked were no longer dormant lines on a page. They had become veins of silence running through the mountains, expanding. And if the pattern was correct, if each awakening required new witnesses, then soon another would hear the call. Maybe you. For silence is never empty. It is only waiting for a listener, if this story has held you through its final descent. Through war, disappearance, and the slow unearthing of something older than history. Then let the echo continue. Leave a trace, a comment, a mark of your presence, and share the darkness with others. Subscribe, stay near the silence, and remember, the captain's path never ends. It only waits for the next to walk, where the echo does not return.